Well, the name Jose Carvajal Lopez has become an increasingly well-known name in Islamic archaeology over the last few years, and we're very fortunate to welcome him tonight to give us a lecture. He started his career back in 2001 with a degree in history at Granada University, following with the equivalent of an MA and a PhD on the Islamic ceramics at Castillo de Illora in Granada, and in Medina Elbira, in a medieval occupation of La Vega de Granada back in 2007. It's followed with a series of postdocs at Granada, a Marie Curie fellowship at Sheffield in 2010 to 12. And then in 2013, he was invited to UCL Qatar as a visiting academic and taking up a lectureship there until he moved to Leicester, where he currently is in 2018. And since then, and in the meantime, he's been establishing himself as a significant name. Noel, could you quieten that noise?
I just try to mute everybody.
Marwa Khalifa, I think it is. I can see. He's been establishing himself as a significant name in the field of Islamic archaeology. He's the reviews editor for the Journal of Islamic Archaeology, and he's been conducting field work in Qatar. Some very useful and interesting work, actually, looking at the nomadic element in the population and the small settlements along the Gulf, which are potentially a really important component of our understanding of the development of the early Islamic economy. And it's exactly that he's going to be talking about to us tonight, a lecture entitled Nomads and Connectivity in the Gulf in the Early Islamic Period, an Archaeological Perspective. Jose. Oh, I should just say, if you don't mind, Jose, if there are any questions at the end, if you could you could type them into the chat, which I'll try and keep on top of, but it's better actually if you use, you can raise your hand and I'll ask you to read your question out loud, if that's okay. Jose, please, we're looking forward to this lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Derek. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay. Can you confirm that you can see the screen? Is it visible?
Yes, all visible.
Yes, fine.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much to everybody for your attendance to this lecture. I'm very pleased to see so many people. I'm very pleased to see so many people I have read, and I have admired for such a long time. So just to warn to these people, this is a lecture which I have designed for the wider public. So if you find that there are details are missing of my work, I'm very happy to provide them in the discussion afterwards, or in subsequent debates. So in this lecture, as I also would like to thank, of course, the IASA organization for inviting me to deliver this lecture today. So in this lecture, I'm going to focus on the nomadic element of the early Islamic economy, as Derek has said. And I'm going to try to argue that there is a significant tendency to oversee what, not to oversee, to not to take into account what the nomadic people were doing, at least in the Gulf. And I think that this could be very important. So in order to make this point, I have structured my talk in different parts. In the first part, I'm going to describe what I'm calling the connectivity and top to bottom exchange paradigm. So how we tend to see connectivity and how we tend to see exchange. Then I'm going to try to build a counter paradigm based on some problems that a very quick look at the data show. Basically, there are very sticking points that emerge when looking at the data that seem to go against the top to bottom paradigm. So I'm going to try to build a bottom to top paradigm. Then I will talk more extensively about my own work in Qatar, and in particular about the Crowded Desert project and how that fits with other data, with other excavations and surveys that there are in the Gulf. And finally, I will be making my point about the nomads. And I will make the point that we are probably underestimating the role of nomads in the development of early Islamic economies and in fact of the early Islamic world and society. So first of all, I'd like to focus on the Indian Ocean very quickly. The Indian Ocean, as you can see, is a big mass of water that seems to be limiting, but actually it's connecting different parts of the world, significant parts of the world where different civilizations, different cultures have been in contact for centuries, for most of human history. When it comes to Arabia, usually we tend to think of Arabia as like the landmass that interacts with the Indian Ocean, mainly through two channels, which are the Red Sea and the Persian Arabian Gulf. Basically the way in which we see the economy in the exchange economy in the Indian Ocean, it's at least from the point of view of the Arabian perspective, is that if as a period, as a succession of periods in which sometimes the trade goes through the Red Sea, sometimes the trade goes through the Arabian Gulf. But the truth is that the Indian Ocean is part of a larger system of connection, which involve also a lot of land trade. And in fact, for most of human history, most of the important connections between these civilizations, particularly between, and I'm going to talk particularly about China and the Asian connection and the Eurasian connection with the West, so with the Persian area, Parthian and Sasanian, and with the Roman area, there has been the development has been mainly through landlocked trade, and that doesn't mean that trade was not happening in the Indian Ocean, but this trade was very much bonded to spheres of exchange that will get in touch. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not developments that are significant in pre-Islamic history. So, for example, here you can see the map of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is a work compiled in the 1st century, and it shows that there was connection between the Mediterranean and at least the Western Indian Ocean, probably a little bit farther than that. But what we can see is that, first of all, this trade for most of human history until the Islamic period was sort of secondary to the connection by land. And the other thing is that this trade, as I was saying, depended on the contact between different spheres of exchange. So basically, to present my idea to you in this in a very simple way, different areas of exchange will have intense connectivity between them. So, for example, A could be the Mediterranean or the Eastern Mediterranean, B could be the Persian area, etc. And only in the areas where these different spheres of exchange touch each other, you can find interactions and between different areas, and this is how long distance trade will be working. So basically, it would be possible to connect flows, objects, or ideas even in between A and B, but they will have to be going through all these different spheres of exchange. What is new about the Islamic period, at least in the Indian Ocean, is that for the first time in history, we have to have a sustained, and I'm not saying that this was not possible before, I'm saying that there is a sustained trend of direct connection between the very distant parts of this network, between A and B, which in this case A and B I'm talking between Arabia and China. Okay, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that this is happening. Just to review a few bits of evidence, we have a lot of presence of Muslims in China very early in history. In fact, the early Chinese text, the Chinese text that inform us of the early history of Islam in China seem to give very, very early dates, sometimes as early as before the Hijra. This has been proved by sinologists that is basically a poor translation of the Hijra dates in Western dates. But still, even with the corrections that have been made, it is very clear that we have Chinese Muslims in the Chinese world as early as the mid 7th century, so only a few decades after the Hijra, and they are building mosques. A lot of these mosques are due to land travel, and we know about an Abbasid army that that travel all the way to China to work at the service of the emperor. But in other cases, like for example the mosque in Guangzhou, which is a port, it's much more likely to think that these mosques were founded by communities of Muslims that have arrived in the area by sea. We also have, of course, the shipwrecks, which provide tantalizing evidence. It's also a bit polemical in some cases. There are very different opinions about the value of the shipwrecks, because it's very difficult to tell where a ship was going from where it was traveling. But in some cases, most specialists tend to admit that the shipwrecks of, for example, of the Belitung shipwreck or the Shiramun shipwreck seem to be good evidence of direct connection, of, if we're not talking about direct connection, at least a very large expansion of these spheres of trade, of which I was talking before. But we also have written evidences, and this remain the most tantalizing proof of connection between the two areas. And when I talk about connection, I talk about direct and sustained connection. So we have heard in different sources about colonies of Persian or Western merchants, and when the sources in Chinese use Persian, there's always the question is, are they talking about Persians, or are they talking actually about Muslims? But we have mentions of them in Hainan, in Guangzhou, two different mentions, two different dates, and in Jiangsu, in the also very early in the 8th century. So it is safe to say that there is this increasing connectivity around the 8th and 9th centuries, and we will look a little bit at the dates now. But what I'm interested now here in this, what I'm interested here in this slide is on the discussion on what are the reasons for this increasing connectivity, for this apparently sudden direct connection between these different parts, these long distant parts of the world. The explanation that has been usually looked for it's mostly based in this paradigm that I'm presenting to you here as the top to bottom exchange paradigm, which is basically the idea that the long distance exchange can only be the result of an investment that has to be the result of an elite interest or even state investment, because only these agents will be able to provide the capital, the resources, the infrastructure, the legal structure. And therefore, if we follow that paradigm, there are only a limited number of options that we can use to explain how this investment, how this connectivity, long distance connectivity develop. So for example, so one of these options will be to find the agency of that drove this connectivity in South Asian or East Asian parts of the world. I've written partners, but it's not a word that I really like. So for example, China could be investing this, but this is not an option that has been documented. It's very unlikely. It's also not the way in which Chinese economy and Chinese state should usually work in the past. We know that China was very active in the Indian Ocean Sea, at least in the 15th century, but it doesn't seem to have been that active and that interested in getting involved in the Indian Ocean, at least in the Central and Western Indian Ocean before. Another option is to suppose that there was Persian connectivity before that, either because of the Parthians or the Sasanians were already in contact with China. And it is true that we have Chinese sources talking to us about the Parthian and the Sasanian empire, but these sources usually tend to reflect exchanges by land, and there is no clear documentation of any interest or any involvement or any development or investment of the Parthians or the Sasanians in the Indian Ocean Sea. So therefore, to argue that there's a continuation of this investment and that this evidenced connectivity between China and the Arabian Peninsula in the early Islamic period is a continuation of something that was happening before is not very well grounded on evidence. So the third option, which is the preferred option of most specialists, is that this peaking connectivity emerged basically because there was a lot of investment of the caliphates of either the Umayyads or more likely the Abbasid Caliphate, because it's during the Abbasid Caliphate where we can see much more development of events or investments of phenomena that show us that this is happening. Now let me go a little bit deeper into this option, into this explanation. Of course, when we're talking about the caliphates, we know that there is a large expansion of the caliphate in the early years, in the first century of the Islamic State, with the first with the Prophet, then with the Rashidun Caliphates, and then with the Umayyad Caliphate. But then most of our sources seem to indicate that it was with the Abbasids that took over after the Umayyads in the mid-8th century, when this development, this investment in the Indian Ocean trade developed. So, when the clearest sign of this investment will be the foundation of Baghdad by the Caliph al-Mansur in 762. But to Baghdad, to the foundation of Baghdad, we could add a lot of foundation and investment in other cities or places in the Gulf. So, for example, besides Baghdad, we have the important port of Basra, which was officially funded by the Muslims in 637, but of course, it was taking the place of very important ports of previous periods, Karax, Spasinu, or Alubula. So it seems that the port of Basra was repurposed by Baghdad as a port of trade to link the capital with the Indian Ocean. We have the foundations of Siraf and Sohar, which archaeology has placed roughly in these dates, in Sohar in the early 8th century, Siraf around the 9th century. And we have, I'm putting here it as a city, but Murwab is not a city. The important archaeological site of Murwab, which the archaeologists usually call a large village. I sometimes tend to go into the urban scale to describe Murwab, and you will see how. But what I'm interested here is that Murwab seems to emerge as a very important and well-connected site, whether urban or large village, around the same period in which Siraf and Sohar are emerging. So we are talking about a period of urban foundation or landscape structuration that is happening between the 8th and the 9th century. Now, this seems in principle to match roughly the dates of the trade that we know in China and the Indian Ocean. So here in this slide, you can see the two timelines of the two different areas. Below, you can see the foundation of the different cities that I presented to you in the previous slide. Above, you can see the evidence that we have mainly by written sources of developments that are happening in China. So we have the first arrival of Muslims in China around the second half of the 8th century. During the around the second half of the 7th century. During the 8th century, we have a lot of sources indicating that there is a lot of interest in the by the Tang state to regulate naval trade. And when I mean naval trade, I mean to regulate how ports should deal with merchandise, with foreigners, with traders that came to Chinese ports. And it is late in the 8th century when we have the first direct itinerary collected in the so-called Jiadang itinerary, which explains the route between China and between Guangzhou and Baghdad. Although it is thought that this itinerary was collected at the inverse. It's not thought that any Chinese traders were doing this itinerary, although it's perfectly possible, of course, that a Chinese traveler did it. And it's only a little bit later that we have the first itinerary in Arabic, the itinerary of Al-Tajir, which is basically the same itinerary of Jiadam, but collected some 50 years later. Now, this is going to get a little bit complicated, and I apologize for that, but I hope that you will bear with me and that you will understand what I'm trying to do this. What I have added just now, the information that I have added just now, is the dates in which we have mentions to the colonies of Western people in China, so Hainan, Guangzhou, and Jiangsu. And now I'm going to add two earlier mentions of Persian ships that were trading in the Eastern Indian Ocean, because they were used by Buddhist monks to travel between India and China. So the first one is Yijing, which is mentioned in 651, and then we have a mention, well, I think, which is a Korean monk in 728. Now, what this seems to be showing is that the dates are actually not so in agreement as we could talk at the beginning. What I'm doing here now is I'm isolating the dates of the 8th century mostly, which is when we see the large growth of activity in the Western Indian Ocean. And what we can see is that the dates seem to be slightly earlier for the foundation of places like Baghdad or Siraf, which are considered to be like the big places of the investment of the Caliphate in the Indian Ocean trade. So what emerges from this picture is that there are problems with this top-to-bottom exchange paradigm, because the direct connectivity between the Gulf starts booming around the 8th century, and it reaches its peak around the 9th century. And what by the dates that we have for the foundation of the Gulf cities, it looks like they are catching up. They are not predating it. So it will be strange to think that they are actually created as an investment to develop this trade. So basically, the trade seems to have been there, and the cities have been founded by the state, by the Islamic State, to take over and to control that trade. But then that leaves the question: who were the merchants? Who was trading before? If we don't assume that the trade was a continuation from the Sasanian period, who was trading? Who was developing this trade? And this is what I would like to present in the counter paradigm. Rather than thinking of the exchange as an initiative from the top to the bottom by elites or by the state, we should think of different groups that could have the possibilities and the interest to develop this trade. And I think my idea, which is a bit of a provocation, is to think that basically there are two elements that are required for this exchange to be developed. The first will be the capital in the widest sense. So it's basically the resources to trade, but also the resources to transform whatever you have in something else that you can trade with. So for example, transform your product in coin. And the other is the possibility of mobility, both passive and active. So active is the mobility that you have because you have the resources yourself, and you have the way of life that allows you to move. And passive is because you live in a world that allows you to move because you're not bounded by rules, and you're not bounded by a lack of infrastructures, etc. So where can we find these two resources, the capital and the mobility? When we look at the Gulf, there's actually a fair number of places where we can think of concentration, where we can see that capital is being concentrated, that it exists. For example, here you have the Christian sites that have been documented both in written sources and in the archaeological sources. There's a lot of questions here about the dating of this. We know that the written sources are very early. So the sites that are mentioned in the written sources tend to be a lot earlier than the sites that are documented archaeologically. And this, thanks to the archaeology mainly, we know that a lot of these Christian sites, monasteries essentially, continue existing until around 900. And we know also, thanks to the archaeology, about the capacity to concentrate capital, about the capacity to bring merchants that will bring things that the monks need to live, artisans to create the churches, etc. This is at a slightly smaller scale, a similar phenomenon to what we have seen in the Mediterranean in the 8th century, which is that the monasteries of the Mediterranean are investing and are making possible the trade. Now, I don't think that these monasteries have that capacity to invest. They have the capacity to support the trade, but I think that the problem with these monasteries is in many cases, they will not be made up by people who are as mobile. So we will have to find the mobility and perhaps the capital also in other places. Of course, when we think about the Gulf and when we think about Arabia and the territories behind, there's a group that is very well known for their capacity to move, their mobility. I'm talking about the Bedouins, who are by definition nomads, who have always been considered, even when the first Muslims, most of them came from families that at least have nomadic branches, they have always been considered from a very ambiguous perspective by settled people in the Islamic world. And this is mainly related to the ideas of Ibn Khaldun, which are still permeating the way that we look at nomads today. So when we tend to think about the nomads, we look at them through the lens of the written sources. And the written sources usually are written by people who are living in cities or who are living in courts, and they transmit the ideas of them that people in these places had. So they were looked at with suspicion, and it was thought that in many cases that it was better to have them sedentarized or at least serving in the army. And this is why we are losing a lot of ideas and a lot of perspective of the possibility of what the nomads could be doing in these earlier periods. Basically, when the sources don't talk about them, or when the sources talk about them as if they were almost wild people. But however, we are starting to know a little bit more about the nomads. So if we look at the Gulf in this range of dates, basically between the 7th and the beginnings of the 10th century, we are starting to see a lot of sedentarized communities. But these are rural communities. They don't seem to be related.
Lily, give me some more water, please.
This not seem to be related to cities, at least not to large scale urban places. But they are, but in some cases, for example, Kadima, clearly, they seem to be related to the sedentarization of nomadic communities. There are other places in which we will have to discuss that, but I would like to propose that maybe a lot of these sites are emerging basically because nomadic communities are finding ways to become sedentary, and they are not being pushed, they are not being forced to become sedentary. They are basically finding it useful to become sedentary. I have just included here a few archaeological sites that I know better, and I'm sure that with the collective knowledge that we have here, there will be a lot more sites that we could discuss. There's of course a lot more evidence in that is emerging in other places in Eastern Arabia, in southern Iran. But the place I'd like to talk more about today, of course, is Qatar, which is the area that I have investigated most. And to Qatar now I look. So what you are seeing now, it's a little map of archaeological sites, most of which were already located by Philip Macumber in his work. The map that you are seeing was basically created by Robert Carter, who's now working in Qatar museums, and by personal communication with Robert, they have a lot more sites. So what you are seeing here is only a bit of the potential of sedentary sites that could have a nomadic origin, and this is only in the north of Qatar. The current maps that I have been able to see thanks to Robert have a lot more sites all over the country. So when these sites have been analyzed, because as you will see, only one of them has been excavated so far, and we will talk about that later on. But when these sites have been analyzed, they always look at with the lens of this other site, this important site, which I mentioned before, Murwab, which is about, which has been dated around the 9th century. Normally, it's dated around the second half of the 9th century. The current archaeologist of this site, Alexandrine Gagan, to whom I owe this map, by the way, she also thinks that we could push a little bit earlier the chronology. But anyway, it's very clear that Murwab, it has to be dated around the 9th century because of the density of finds, the density of the Samarra horizon that has been found there. And as you can see, it's a very substantial site. This is why I was saying before that I think that we can push Murwab a little bit in the sense of urban scale, although it's true that it's not probably a city. It's composed mainly of a cluster of archaeological sites around a fort, and at least 2 mosques have been documented in Murwab. Now, the dating of Murwab, which is very well established, has pushed the dating of the other archaeological sites that I showed in the previous slide to a period, to the same period basically. So the idea, the model that has ruled the dating of the rural archaeological sites in Qatar is basically an urban model in which Murwab is like an urban center, and the archaeological sites, the rural sites around Murwab, are satellite places that are being used to exploit the landscape. Now, there were things that could be questioned about this model, and this is partly why I developed the Crowded Desert project in Qatar when I was a member of UCL Qatar. This project was funded by the Qatar Foundation. It was developed in partnership with Qatar Museums. And while I was working this project, I worked in 2 different universities, UCL Qatar and the University of Leicester. So the whole idea of this project was to try to find out about the relationship between nomads and sedentary people in the desert of Qatar. In particular, we aim for a small area, around 25 square kilometers in the northwest part of the country, which you can see here. This area was relevant because it has a concentration of archaeological sites, of archaeological evidence, and it's also part of a wider area where there's even more archaeological evidence. So within this area was the site of Murwab, for example, which we didn't look in the project because we wanted to keep away from Murwab, because we didn't have permissions to look at Murwab anyway. But also in the wider area, so outside of the survey area, but very close, are other relevant archaeological sites, like Al Subara, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site of Qatar, and Ruwaita. So it's an area with a lot of concentration of archaeological sites from different periods. So what we did was to develop a survey which will cover very detailedly different areas. We have a small pilot season in 2015, which gave us a lot of data from a very small area of 36 hectares. And then from 2016 onwards, with a wider team, in which some members are present here today, we were able to go a lot bigger, and we were able to do a lot more of the area of the survey. So we covered, if you remember in the previous slide, we were looking at 36 hectares. Now you are looking at grids in square kilometers. So we are talking about almost 5,000 hectares. And we were able to cover that in 3 different modes of intensity. So we have a very extensive survey, we have an intensive survey, and we have what we call an ultra intensive survey, where we documented every feature. And besides that, we were able also to excavate in different places. Now, there's a lot of results of this survey, and still processing most of them. But the ones on which I have been focusing in the last few years are very much related to the topic that I'm talking about today, to the dating of these nomadic sites. Just to give you a few shots of the different types of material culture that we could find, and just to give you also an idea of the different periods that were documented. Obviously, for this talk, I'm focusing on the second period, which is roughly what we have dated as late Sasanian to early Islamic. So we could roughly date most of the material culture that we found in this second phase between the 4th and the 10th century. And that's a bit generous. Probably it's a shorter interval. But anyway, talking about this period, one thing that we found that was very interesting is that we start seeing in this second period of occupation the development of nomadic occupation in a very particular model, in a very quite clear model, which we define with an ethnographical perspective and with archaeological evidence. So we came up with what we are calling an ethno-archaeological model. I don't want to go into very much detail about this model, but basically it means that we were able to identify, when we're looking at a nomadic site, that it is a nomadic site, even if it has evolved into something more complex. So there are a number of features that most nomadic sites that we were able to look at had, and we found a lot of these features also in permanent sites. And one of these sites, which was very relevant for us, is precisely the site of Jogbi, or Jugbi, which is in the area of our survey. So when we found Jogbi had been originally found by Beatrice de Carvi, and it was in the archaeological system of Qatar Museum. So we actually didn't find Jogbi out of nowhere. It was already well documented, and of course, even before it was documented, it was well known to the nomads and to the Qatari people. So this is when I'm talking about discovering Jogbi, I'm not taking the merit of knowing that Jogbi was there. But what we did was to document it very carefully and to date the material culture that we could find, which gave us very early dates. As you can see, 7th and 9th centuries. And this was raising a very interesting question, because this was contradicting the current model that we have on the dating of the rural archaeological sites in Qatar. So basically, if these survey dates were corrected, the modeling, the dates that we have in regarding for dating the rural sites around Murwab will have to be partial a little bit earlier, and that will mean that the whole model of occupation of the landscape will have to be rethought. So this is why in the last season of the field work, we decided to go for a full excavation in Jogbi. Here you can see some shots. You can see some of the things that we found, and I'm going to go very quickly over the most relevant finds. So basically, we opened 4 trenches, and in these 4 trenches, we documented at least 5 buildings. We didn't document any mosque, although we thought that we could have found one, but eventually it turned out not to be a mosque. So basically, we don't have, as far as we know, we don't have any mosques in Jogbi. The architectural arrangements of these buildings on their whole orientation was very much in line with the model that we have defined, the ethno-archaeological model that we have defined for our nomadic campsites. This suggests, and the whole facing seems to suggest, that basically this was originally a place where tents were installed, and eventually the places of the tents became more or less fixed, more or less solidified with stone walls. And the interesting thing is that this nomadic model still can be still compared with things that have been developing very recently. So, for example, here one of the houses of the building 2 of Jogbi can be very easily compared with the plan of the house of Hussein ibn Ramstan in Suwailiya, which is in the center of Qatar. There's also a lot of interesting things if we compare directly this site with Murwab. So, because the architecture of this site is abutted, so the walls are abutted to each other. They are not bonded. The corners in Jogbi are rounded. They are not square, and these are clear contrasting points with the architecture that has been noted in Murwab. This seems to suggest that this is an architecture that it's being developed in a different way. It's being a lot more ad hoc and probably less planned than the one that we can see in Murwab. And the most interesting part where I wanted to reach is where, the phasing of the excavation. So we were able to identify at least 3 phases in the excavations. The phase 1 was defined by features in the ground, which were used for tents or for ephemeral constructions. Phase 2 is the one that corresponds to the stone buildings, not only to the stone buildings, but the whole life cycle of the stone buildings. We are talking about their erection, their use, and their abandonment. And phase 3, it's a very brief reoccupation, which could only be found in a very particular part of the site. But of course, the important thing is when can we actually date chronologically each one of these phases. So we have C14 dates, and we were able to provide a chronology for all these phases. And just presenting you this information in this slide so that you can see that the C14 dates within the 2 sigma interval, the most confident interval, are very solid. We're talking about, in most cases, we're talking about almost 90% of confidence, if not the full 95.4% of confidence. But here in this other slide, you can see the relationship between the C14 dating, the most robust C14 dating, the phases of the excavation, and the periods of the historical periods. And as I hope that you can see, the most important part of this dating is that the erection, use, and abandonment of the stone buildings, they all correspond to phase 2, which is very clearly in line. It's almost clearly in line with the Umayyad phase. And this is an anecdote that I always had to tell whenever I present this data. When I saw these dates in the C14, I had to call the lab and make sure that they had not made a mistake. And of course, they got really upset with me because that's not something that you ask of a lab. But they confirmed that the dates are correct and that there's no reason to put in question at these dates. So what we have here is basically we have a very clear dating of the Umayyad period to the Umayyad period of a sedentarized side, or at least of a sedentary phase of a nomadic community. Let's talk a little bit also about what we could see in the site, what we could find, and these are all the finds that you are going to see here, and we are talking about 99% of the finds of the whole site. They all belong to phase 2, because there are very few finds that could be dated to phase 1 or phase 3. So we have ceramics from all over the Gulf and beyond. We have turquoise green glaze, which is actually incredibly abundant. But we also have other ceramics that petrographic analysis is starting to suggest that they could be dated to at least to the south of Iran, perhaps also to other parts of Eastern Arabia. We have shells that are coming from India, like the limbers and the Indian cooking pots types. We have also soapstone vessels, and the soapstone vessels could only come either from the Hijaz or from Oman, as far as we know, for the sources. I'm talking here to in relationship to parallels in Kadima. We have metal and glass fragments. These items most probably have to come from southern Iran. There's a possibility also that they come from Egypt, but we haven't been able to do analysis yet. And of course, we have a lot of material culture that suggests that Jogbi, in spite of being 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers inside, is actually a marine site. It's deeply connected to the sea. So we have a lot of marine shell, but we also have this, which is a set of cast net weights. Now, this set of weights was found in a very special position. They were excavated in a context that was under a collapsed wall. Under this position suggests very strongly that all these weights were threaded together in a string that was hanging from a nail on the wall. And when the wall collapsed, the connection remained. Of course, the string disappeared, but the connection remained. There are hundreds of parallels of cast net weights all over the Gulf, and here you can see a few of them. There is a lot of ethnographical information about the use of cast nets. When I presented these results in the Seminar for Area Study, Julian was kind enough Julian Jansen was kind enough to suggest that this could be a very small net used to catch birds, which is perfectly possible. But it is also possible that this, rather than being a net, is basically a set of weights that could have been used to repair the nets if necessary. The fact that we find this, and the fact that we think that these are fishing nets, it matches also the evidence, the scarce evidence that we have been able to analyze at archaeological level. We don't have archaeological analysis. There are very few animal remains, but some of the few animal remains that we have from Jogbi are fish bones. So we know that at least these people were going to the sea, which, as we said, is not that far away, and it makes sense because they are very well connected to the coast. Now, coming back to this set of weights, there is also a dimension of interest here when we look at how it was made. Most of the weights are basically made of discarded pottery. This means that a pot was broken, and a shell large enough was reused to create a net. We have 4 of them, which are actually specifically made, and we know they are specifically made because they have the door around the hole. We have one made of stone, which seems to be very opportunistic, but then all the rest are coming from pottery pots that, and most of them can actually be identified. So we have one which is a Lis pot, which is a type of pottery that is very frequent in the Gulf since at least Assyrian times, but also during the Islamic times. We have even a turquoise shirt, so basically part of a large turquoise jar. We have 5 of them which come from torpedo jars, and we have 13 of them which we have categorized as commonware. But in Qatar, there is no possibility, no known possibility of making pottery. So we think that this commonware is probably coming from a different part of the world, most probably from southern Iran, from the other side of the coast. So what we suggest is that this community was well connected, and it was not only well connected enough to have elements of material culture from different parts of the world, but their abundance of elements of material culture was such that they could actually discard and reuse. They have enough discard to reuse the pots in particular ways. So they have frequency. They have a given frequency of this connection with other parts of the Gulf. Now, let's look a little bit at the phases, and let's think about what it means in terms of thinking about the nomadic investment, the nomadic role in all this large scenario of connectivity. So as you can see here, you can see the phases of Jogbi in comparison with the different with the dates of the foundation of the different sites in the Gulf, and you can see that phase 2 is a lot earlier than any of them, with the only exception of Basra, which is a lot earlier because of its role in early Islamic history. Now, let me come back to this very complicated timeline, and just to simplify a little bit, I'm just going to kind of delete everything, and I'm going to put phase 2 of Jogbi on top of that. So if you look at that, if we make a little bit the same trick that we did before, you can see that the dates of Jogbi are actually much more in line with the development phase of the early Islamic trade. So we are talking about the first half, the second half of the 7th century, and the first half of the 8th century. So it's very much in line with the development of this peaking connectivity between Arabia and China. Now, we don't have, and I know someone is going to ask this eventually, we don't have any direct evidence of connection between Jogbi and China. There's no Chinese porcelain, or there's nothing like that. But the matching of dates, I think it's important. I think it's talking about a period of time in which people, and probably nomads, are moving. So if we look at this other slide, what I have done here is I kept the dates of Jogbi, but I have placed the dates of other very important events that are happening in the area, in the Middle East at this time. So we have, of course, the Islamization of Arabia between the Hijra and the end of the Rida Wars. We have the invasion of the Sasanian Empire, which is, of course, immediately following the Rida Wars, and it lasts until the first half of the 7th century. And we have also the evidence of the phenomenon of the Asraki anti-caliph in Kerman in the late 7th century, which the name of this anti-caliph is Qatari ibn al-Fuyyah. Now, the fact that his name is Qatari doesn't mean that he's from Qatar, although some people will argue that, but it's very likely that he was at least from Eastern Arabia. We also know that a lot of nomads, a lot of Eastern Arabian Arabs traveled to the other side of the Gulf during the Sasanian invasion. In fact, we know that there are 2 waves in the Sasanian in the invasion of the Sasanian Empire, one by land, but a second one following shortly afterwards was by sea. So many Arabs traveled to the other side of the Gulf. So this means that Arabs were moving a lot. Arabs have been probably moving a lot around before, that's true. But in this case, they are moving in a different way. They are conquering, or rather, they are plundering, and they are becoming incredibly successful in bringing capital together and in establishing contacts. I think that it is very relevant, very important to consider these movements and these developments in the light of what is happening, the rise of the Indian Ocean trade to China in this period. I think that we cannot forget what was happening, and I think that we need to think that the nomads were deeply involved in in everything that was happening. And the way in which they were involved, it's basically leaving traces like they had never left before. We could call it sedentarisation. I'm not sure if sedentarisation is necessarily the only thing that they did. But I think that if we look at different periods in history where we have other processes in which nomads become sedentarized, in which they basically become economically stable enough to think on changing their lifestyle, or at least to think on having part of their tribes, part of their families, changing the lifestyles, where other part of their families could have continued the mobility pattern. It will make a lot of sense to consider that they could be responsible for this. Maybe not directly responsible, but at least have a large share of responsibility on this rising connectivity. So basically what I am suggesting here is that nomads who are being finding a period of their history in which they have a lot of economic stability and a lot of success, they have the interest, the capacity to move, and they have the capital in this particular period in which they are involved in the expansion of the nomadic state to develop all these trade links. So basically what I'm saying is that the nomads could be a very interesting candidate for this bottom to top initiative to explain the exchange, the peak in connectivity in the early Islamic period. This is what I would like to leave it. And of course, I'm very happy to take any questions, and I'm very happy to discuss. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jose, for a very interesting interpretation of this amazing data set that we find across Eastern Arabia. And I think some very interesting ideas there. I'm sure that there will be lots of questions and comments. Could I ask people, if they do have a question, to put their hand up? You can use the reactions bar at the bottom to put your hand up, and I'd like ideally people to be able to read out their questions. But if you feel you'd rather type them into the chat, I'll try to keep on top of those questions. I'll kick off while people are getting their heads together a little bit. So just can I clarify, Jose, what you're arguing? You believe that the deserts in an area such as the nomads in an area such as Qatar are investing in Indian Ocean trade at this early period, and that trade is going through their settlements in Qatar, or it's ending in their settlements in Qatar, or are they acting as middlemen between, I don't know, Basra and Iraq? And could you elaborate a little bit on exactly how you see that trade operating through these areas?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I haven't reached that far. I mean, my proposal is very modest, is that we should try to find this impetus for trade, for exchange rather, in the activity of the nomads. I guess if you force me to answer, I guess that it will be very much ad hoc. I think that the nomads will be finding whatever opportunities they could find, and if they could see that traveling to Basra, developing links with Basra will be useful, that will be, of course, an option. But I think the most interesting thing for me is to think about possible groups of nomads moving across the Gulf, basically because they were across the Gulf and beyond the Gulf, across the Indian Ocean, because that's what they did, and that is what they got used to do during the Islamic expansion.
I see. Okay. Right. Well, I might come back to a couple of points in a minute, but I know that Phil Macumber, who's joining us actually from New Zealand, and it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. Phil, are you awake? I'm not.
Yeah,
not
I'm
saying,
still awake. I don't know how, but I'm still awake.
would you? Well, it was the exciting lecture that's kept you awake, no doubt. What's the? Would you like to read your question, or would you like me to read it out for you?
If you could, I'd certainly appreciate it.
I might have to give it in a note of explanation. We might ask it. So Phil is asking.
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. What interests me with the appearance of the linear villages, and you've certainly taken them back a bit earlier, is there's a massive gap after the Neolithic in Qatar. And that's a period of landscape instability. It represents a period when there's massive seawater intrusion. Of course, aridity came in about 6,000 years ago. And then you have this appearance for the first time of these villages all lined up after this large gap in time. I would see that, I would think of that as somehow relating back to settlement came after the stabilization of the landscape. It's a lot to do with aquifer salinity, but do you see anywhere else where you can relate or attempt to relate the appearance of these very early Islamic sites with landscape stability?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Phil, and thank you so much for coming to see my lecture so late.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
I only know about the sites in Qatar. I mean, I think that probably Derek will be in a better position to explain this question, because the data that I have taken from the Gulf basically comes from his work. What I think is that the climate explanation, or the climatic change explanation, has a place, but I think it's very risky to assume that all the responsibility of change, or of the settlement change, it's only due to changes in climate. First of all, because it doesn't work for a lot of the Gulf, because, as you know, there's a lot of cultures developing in this interval that you have mentioned. It's true that Qatar, there's a dearth of evidence of settlement, but we have evidence of tombs. The problem is that we don't seem to have evidence of settlement yet. And it will be interesting to find out what is going on there. But certainly, I think that it is possible that we might still find settlement in Qatar before the early Islamic period. Now, I don't know how to frame that. Does that answer your question? I don't know if Derek wants to comment for.
Sure, no, it certainly does, to a degree anyway. Some things aren't so just readily understood. We can just sort of move towards them, I think.
I think that I'd just say that I could build in a question here from Julian Lush, that I think many of us who've been working on this period in the region, Rob Carter, I think, would agree with me, will have noted that there's a very marked increase in settlement from around the 8th century across the whole of Eastern Arabia, from Kuwait to Oman. And, the reasons for that are still not clear. And what you've put together today, Jose, makes us think about the engagement of nomads in trade. Julian Lush raises the issue of climate, which I think is also links to what Phil has been asking about. And maybe you could say something about I'm just looking back at Julian's. Could you say something about the climate in that period, and sources of water and grazing and so forth? Have you had any thoughts along those lines that you could share?
One thing I'd like to say is that
I was addressing that to Jose, actually, Phil, if you don't. Sorry.
Okay, sorry, I thought you were addressing it to Philip.
Sorry, I'm not being a very good chair. Right.
No, that's fine. So, I mean, as I said, I don't think that I don't think that you can only blame the climate, if blame is the word, for social change. I mean, what is very clear is that Islamization brings a very important change. And I think it is also very important to think that, one of the things that Islamization brings is this scope for the nomads to move around. I'm basically saying what I have said before. I guess that the question in this case will be, is Islam, the expansion of Islam, in part triggered by this climate change? I think that will be a little bit risky, but obviously I don't think that it's something that you have to choose between one or the other cause. I think that they are both of them interlinked together. I certainly don't have any evidence or any capacity to argue about climatic change or about the weight of the climate change in the early Islamic period.
Okay,
so
thanks, Jose.
Disappointing.
No, thank you for that answer. Robert Carter's got a question. Rob, would you like to speak to us?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Jose, for that. I was just thinking about the towns and, if you like, the possible causative role in trade, whether by urban foundations or nomads or anything else, in fact, because there is a history of urbanism in the Gulf or trading towns in the Gulf prior to the 7th century. At Alabulla, for example, near Basra, and at Rishar before it shifted to Siraf. So do you think it's possible to turn your hypothesis the other way around and see this intensification of settlement in the 7th to the 9th century possibly as an outcome of trade and intensified communication rather than a cause of it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the problem with that is who will the traders be then? That is why I came to the nomads, because if you think of who has the capacity, aka the resources and the ability to move, I could only think of the nomads.
Sure, but there's traders and people, large numbers of people in Alabulla and Rishar, for example, and I'm sure other places. And there's also people in the desert as well. And of course, the merchants need crew, and they need consumers, and they need producers as well. And in conditions where you get accelerating connectivity and consumption and production. I mean, I hate to sound like a Marxist here, but when these things happen, you do get changes in settlement pattern. Certainly, you get that in recent centuries, and I'm wondering if this could be what we're seeing. So it's actually quite difficult to unpick a cause. Now, I know you would never go for a single cause explanation anyway, but it's difficult to separate the chicken from the egg. You're in a feedback situation or a mutual feedback situation, and if people are making money on the boats, then that feeds back into where they are living when they're not on the boats, and they can afford to buy more stuff or live places which might not have been economically viable before, because they can buy foodstuffs and hardware from outside and yet still go and live a relatively free life in the desert or in a village in the desert, whereas previously they would have had to range much more extensively and leave much less in terms of material culture. I mean, I haven't really thought this through either, but I'm wondering whether it's possible to see which direction these things are coming from, causatively. But that's all.
Yeah.
Just to,
No, that's definitely a very interesting question, and it's, as you say, it's a chicken or egg situation. I guess that, I mean, if you push me for an answer, because I'm not sure I can provide an answer here, but I guess that it is possible that there is certainly exchange and trade before that, and the fact that Al-Bula and Richard are there is a testament to that. We also know that there is exchange because of the works of Derek and Seth Prisman. But my question there was, why wouldn't these people develop the trade to China before? And in this case, then you have to count on the agency of the nomads bringing this impetus, either as a sort of capital accumulation and then providing the merchants with the capacity to do this, or as becoming themselves the agents of this trade. But again, I think at the moment with the data that we have, I don't think that we can solve that question. But it's definitely something we should think about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you.
Could I just say one more thing, please?
Go ahead, Phil.
When we look at this period, this sudden appearance of all these Islamic sites after such a long gap, what we've been looking at over that period of the gap from 4,000 years up until about 1312, 1100 BP, is the coast slowly retreating. It stabilized around about 7 to 900 AD. And with a stable coast, lots of other things stabilized as well, the developments of Sabga and things like this. And it's just this relationship between the stabilized coast and the appearance of these things after such a long period of instability that sort of took my eye.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know how to answer to that. I completely agree with you, because the problem here is not to say, as we were saying, it's one thing or the other. I think that there is clearly a lot of different circumstances that are pushing things in the same direction. So I guess I will agree. And thank you very much for the observation. I don't know if I can answer something else.
Thank you very much, Phil, for that question, and Jose for the answer. We're coming towards the end. I just one final thing, Jose, if you don't mind. You gave a few dates: 700 for the foundation of Siraf, 800 for the foundation of, sorry, the other way around, 700 for the foundation of Sohar, 800 for the foundation of Sohar, and also you mentioned a decline in trade after the end of the 9th. And so leave the latter for the moment. I think Seth's argued in a different way, but how did you get those foundation dates? Because they sound not what I've understood previously.
I mean, I am interpreting them. I mean, 800 for Siraf, I think, is the date that has been normally given. Of course, there's a previous September, is the date that has been given to the mosque of Siraf, I think. And for the date of Sohar, I mean, I took this for the interpretation of the evidence that Seth and you did in Sohar, but obviously you said 8th century, so I'm being a little bit liberal here. I'm taking it to the beginning of the 8th century, so that could be later on in the 8th century.
I think we do need to be careful about those two dates. Well, obviously, White House argued for a Sasanian foundation at Siraf, and I think Seth's reanalysis of the pottery has pushed it a little bit later. But I don't think as far as 800. I think there's evidence there for much earlier, possibly even a little bit of Sasanian settlement. So, and at Siraf, I argued only not that there wasn't a Siraf there before 700, only that we haven't yet found evidence for it. I suspect very strongly that there was a Sasanian Siraf. So I'm sorry, talk about Sohar. I wish they didn't use different letters for their names, you know. But Sohar, so in Oman, I've argued that that site probably did exist. As in the Sasanian period and developed into an Islamic town. It's just that so far we have failed to find anything preceding the about 8th century. So maybe that's something to think about. But I think looking at the time and the fact that Noel switched his camera on suggests to me that that we might be, it's like the Queen putting a handbag on the table at the end of dinner, isn't it? No. I think it probably means that we're drawing the session to a close. I'd just like to finish by saying thank you very much, Jose, for a very interesting and ambitious lecture. And thanks very much for sharing your ideas and making us think a lot about the data set and its wider repercussions.